MCPs are all the rage right now in AI. Everyone's talking about them and how they're a game changer for LLM models. But if you're like me and you're not super technical, it's hard to grasp exactly what an MCP is, what they can do, and what opportunities are right now with MCPs. So I asked my friend JD to come give me the full beginner's guide to MCPs. So JD, I'm excited for today. If somebody watches this video till the end, what can they expect to learn?
Yeah, I think what we're going to learn today is we're going to go through some of the basics, really understand what are the guts of an MCP, how can you use it. We'll go through a quick N8N workflow where we can actually expose that through MCP, and then we'll actually plug that into things like Claude and go through some business use cases of how we can actually turn this into a profitable thing.
Beautiful. MCP for beginners. Let's get into it.
So for me, what MCP is, it's basically a Lego block. And that Lego block will allow you to be consumable and discoverable from an LLM or an AI agent. So you basically have your MCP server, you have your MCP client, and that client connects into your LLM. And what that allows you to do is do a few different things that kind of make up the basics of an MCP. And that's you can take action, which is basically sending requests. So you can do things like connect to an API, you can pull in information from a database, you could technically trigger other workflows or other LLMs, other agents if you wanted to. And then once you get all of that, you get a response back, and that pulls all that information into context for the AI agent. And what that does is it allows you to kind of extend the capabilities of what your AI agent is trying to do. So that Lego piece is essentially a plugin, if you will, to extend your agent. So, when I think about MCPs, there's like a lot of different things that are being discussed in the space. And I see it as like three different areas. And the first is, MCP is useless. And I see this a lot when it's fairly technical, like, why would I use an MCP when I can just as easily use an API? And we'll kind of go through some of the scenarios of what that looks like, right? But basically, an MCP is kind of a universal way for us to communicate into an LLM and take those actions and get requests. And then the second thing people are saying is like, this is just a first draft. Like there's more to come. This isn't the end all be all. It's a flash in the pan. I definitely think that MCP is part of a timeline, but if it is a first draft, it's the best draft that I've seen of how you can have different AI agents communicate together, as well as make that shareable and consumable and discoverable, right? And all three of those things are really important when we start talking about like different agents taking action. And then the last one is that MCP is a universal adapter, and it's kind of the end all be all. I tend to sit in the middle between 2 and 3. Like I said, if it's a first draft, then it's a great first draft. There are some holes in it, the things that we can improve on, but it's still an evolving protocol. And I really like understanding, how did we get here? If we think about ChatGPT, that was like our first kind of mainstream, non-technical way to look at AI, where we could kind of ask questions, and it had a specific standard. Then we started seeing things like AI agents, and those kind of were made up of 3 different components that allowed us to interact with it a little more. And then we had what's called tools, which ultimately still work in MCP. And a tool really operates almost like an API call. It's a function that allows you to call out. But the difference is that any tool didn't follow the same standard, if you will. And that's where MCP kind of comes into play, is now it's a universal way to communicate where all LLMs understand the responses are going to be the same as in how they're structured. And so where we go from here is kind of unknown, but I think this is a great starting place for how things start to communicate together.
I'm going to throw something out there and tell me if this is like totally not true. But is it somewhat like, you have all these different countries with their own currency, right? And then something like crypto comes along, and now it's like, oh, wait, now I can buy something from someone in Japan using this crypto, where like now we can have something that's universal where we all use the same exact currency rather than all having like our own currencies.
Yeah, because like when you all have your own currency, you have to exchange it, right? There's like a different pattern for how you can interact with that. And with like the crypto example, it's universal. Anybody, as long as you're following that same pattern, you know what you're getting. And I think that's the important piece. That's why they like Anthropic kind of talks about how it's the last USB-C cable you'll ever need,
Hmm.
is because it can just plug in. Just like with crypto, you can just send it and anybody can accept it.
Hmm. That makes a lot of sense to me. It's like so universal because it's like, hey, look, if you wanted to go buy something from someone in another country right now, you'd have to go through an exchange rate. Not everyone accepts the same currency. It's a hassle. But if you
Mhm.
all use the same currency, it's like, hey, now there's no reason you can't connect to these other countries and do business with these other countries. And it's sort of the same with MCP, right? If all of these LLMs can understand the same, they all have like the same exact wall plugin, right? When you're traveling internationally, you
Exactly.
don't have to bring that extra connection. You can plug right in to all of them.
Yeah, I really like the outlet connection. That makes a ton of sense, right? It doesn't matter where you're going, you can still plug in.
Yeah, that makes sense to a non-technical lizard brain like me.
Well, and so the other thing we can think about too, and we'll kind of go through this, is not only does it mean you can plug in wherever and MCPs work with LLMs, but different tools can plug in. So we'll look at Claude, we'll look at N8N, like you can think about Cursor, like all of these tools still expect that same plug. And so one MCP can work through multiple LLMs. It can also work through multiple tools.
That makes sense.
And so, like, to your wall outlet idea, like, what's the difference between just using an API and using an MCP? And the biggest difference is really the fact that each one of these APIs communicate in a different way. And so, when I'm talking to the Slack API or the Google API or the GitHub API, or a custom API that I made, I have to program that or set that plug up in two different ways. I have to expect how it looks here in my third party. And then I have to build how I'm going to connect to that in my LLM. And that's where we would see like these tools. Where MCP changes that is it acts as like a man in the middle, right? It's saying all of you, while you have different APIs, I need you to communicate in this fashion so that I have one API that's being communicated to the LLM. And my response from this MCP is always going to look the same, no matter what I'm connecting to.
So that's really the difference between an MCP and an API, right? They can work together, but they're not the same thing.
Yeah, they often do work together. You can see a lot of MCPs, like even in this fashion, where this MCP has access to multiple different APIs. They're all coming into the same MCP server. And you see a lot of producers of MCPs literally wrapping a lot of their APIs and making it as a consumable for LLMs. And I think that's where like some of the friction comes as to, well, why would I use an MCP when I can just use an API? And to me, an MCP lowers the barrier of entry so that like a technical person and a non-technical person can still drop in the same piece of code and it work.
Now, can we walk through an actual example of how we could use an MCP?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take a look at how we can build out a workflow that will use a database and then we're going to connect to it. So in this example, like I basically built this N8N workflow where it's going to go out and it's going to fetch your latest video and so that I can pull that into an LLM later on. And basically, what that means is I'm taking your transcript and I'm putting it into a database in a format that an LLM will understand. And then MCP, rather than an API, is going to expose that to Claude, for instance, and allow me to have a conversation with your video. But I can also share that MCP to anyone, or you can share it out, right?
So, what is the advantage there to using an MCP versus an API to send it over to the LLM?
Yeah. So if we were going to send this out as an API, we would have to define what we wanted the response to be for the LLM. And then we would also have to tell the LLM, you're going to need to expect this wall plug and go ahead and build yourself your own wall outlet to accept that. Whereas when we're using an MCP server and an MCP client, the client will be sitting with the LLM and the agent, and the MCP will be the one that's acting as the connector, and they kind of come together. And so that again is the difference. It's just speaking the same language.
That makes sense.
So basically, now that we have this workflow, we're kind of coming through here, we're grabbing the transcript, we're saving it to this database, and we want to interact with that. And if you think about how to do that with an AI agent, basically you have all of these tools, and each one of these tools has to connect directly to my database. Now, that can kind of present a potential security problem. And it also means that like every single one of these tools has to be programmed specifically to that table. So this is a great way to kind of test and make sure that we're working here. And we say like, okay, well, we're going to go recreate these tools in order to have a chat with an AI agent. But what we really want to do is we want to take that outside of N8N and we want to use it in what we're used to using. So again, that could be Claude, that could be OpenAI, that could be Cursor, whatever. And this to me is where like it really shines. You could expose these as a API, but again, you'd have to build that. So the easiest way, in my opinion, to get started with MCPs is to go into N8N and build what's called an MCP server trigger. And those are incredibly simple. Literally, you can come in here just like you had the AI agent, and you can just type in MCP and you'll get this MCP server trigger, and it gives you a URL, right? No different than an API. You can do authentication, whatever you need to do in order to build this piece. And then you can actually build tools that are associated with that. And so you'll kind of notice that it's almost exactly the same. We're still connecting to the database, but we basically have this layer in front of our table that allows us to access it. And all we have to do in order to build out these tools is just press plus, and we can add whatever we want. We could add another workflow in N8N. So you can have an MCP server that actually triggers new N8N workflows. You could have it make an API call out if you wanted to, but we're just going to connect directly to our Postgres tool. And this is so we can communicate to it. Then if I want to like really kind of focus on how does this actually work, there's two different pieces and they're really important, right? It's just about naming. So when we think about the fact that a MCP needs to be discoverable from an LLM, we need to understand that an LLM is basically going to call out to the MCP server and say, hey, what tools do you have? I'm trying to accomplish this task. And the MCP server is going to respond back with a list of tools. And the LLM will then decide what tool it needs and know how to execute that tool and take the response from that tool. So in this case, we're saying, okay, we have a name of search and we're going to get information about Nick Conley's YouTube videos. The reason these two are important is when I go into the client of the MCP and I say, or the LLM, and I say, hey, I want to search for Nick's videos on like the latest trends, it will go and search for this tool and it'll say, oh, I need this search tool. And I can tell by the description here that I'm looking for your videos. So once we have that mapped together, we can actually connect to this. So where we're going to like spend a little bit of time now is, well, let's actually wire this up, right? We can do this a couple of different ways. We can still do it in N8N. We can come over here and we can just have an AI agent. And this is like a great way to test. And then you never leave the application. But it also doesn't really make it shareable. And, I really like using Claude Desktop. So what I'm going to do is I can just come into the MCP server. I can click on the production URL. I just copy that URL. And now I have a way to connect. So now if we come into Claude and we actually want to take that URL and we want to interact with it, what we can do is if you come into the things, it will actually tell you, you have to turn on developer, but as long as you have developer, it'll show you which MCPs you have turned on. And so I can actually use these MCPs in sequence, right? So if I'm trying to talk to your YouTube videos, but I also want to understand maybe technical documentation or understand how to take what you've discussed and put it into an end-to-end workflow, I can actually do all of that in Claude right now because this tool can talk to this tool and the AI agent allows you to do that. So in order to get these set up, you just have to click edit config. It will launch into a editor and you just have to put in these little blocks. So as you can see, this is where it gets like a little more technical and I can see people getting a little nervous of like, well, how do I read these? Most MCPs will just give you the block that you have to copy and paste. It comes with your name, some arguments. In N8N's case, you only need to really worry about like all these arguments stay the same, and this URL is what changes. Once you have that URL, just like an API, it's going to call out to that, and then the protocol handles the rest. It's going to say, oh, okay, I know what you're trying to do. Here's a list of the tools I have available, and then here's how you can actually work with those, right? Like that communication style. And then again, the information that you're going to get back. So if we go back to Claude and we say, you don't always have to say use the Nick Conley MCP, but I just like to do it just
It's
because.
good measure. Yeah.
Just, you never know. What's something recent that we want to?
Yeah. So I recently had a video come out about how to find customers through Reddit. Maybe, yeah, give me like the top rules for finding customers through Reddit.
And so what we'll see here is it's going to actually start thinking. So right now, this search that matches back to the function name or the tool name that we defined in N8N. And now it's pulling information from the database. So it's looking at the information that it's finding, and in each step, taking this data that it finds and applying it to the next part of the search that it wants to do. So as you can see, it's hit that MCP like 5 different times in order to get information back and then put this into something that's consumable or readable into the LLM.
This is crazy because this is like, yeah, this is literally straight out of my content. Even all the way down to the head of developer relations at OpenAI, which is like a topic that we talked about. I mean, all this is exactly on par. That's exactly what we talked about.
And what's wild about all of this, right, is like this information would never be in the LLM context. So we had to go out and find it. So you can scrape it, you can pull it from the transcript. So if you set up these automations and then store it somewhere, this is how you actually ingest it into the LLM to make it more up to date. And what's even crazier is like, so for a technical person like me, is I can take this information and then bring it into my coding practices or tell it to make like an N8N workflow of this.
Or if you're in marketing, you use all of the rules of copywriting from David Ogilvy or someone like that. You can pull in all these different repositories of data or rules or information or knowledge and pull it directly into your LLM. And it's like actually that, right? So you're not going into ChatGPT every time and saying like, hey, write this like David Ogilvy and follow these 4 rules. It's like, hey, just use this MCP and you have all of the information that you need.
Yeah, you could even like combine them together, right? So we could combine your latest YouTube with another influencer. And as long as we have those 2 MCPs connected, the LLM can pick up from both of them.
Yeah. And I think this also gets really interesting with data, right? Where if you can give the MCP of like your CRM that has all of your customer data or people that you're going after or your financials or things like that, gets really interesting to be able to talk with that data, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you could have another MCP. Again, you could do that in the MCPs here. Like, let's say that you had an MCP for your CRM, you had an MCP of where you're storing your financial data. You can pull all of those together and then take an action. So let's say we had Gmail connection. You could then say, put all this together in an email and use the Gmail MCP to go ahead and send it. And you can do all of this within Claude, right?
That is crazy. One thing that I think about is I worked at Amazon for 3 years, and data is a massive part of working at Amazon, and narratives. And there's the famous one pagers that we'd always write. And in order to write those one pagers, you had to back up your argument with data. And in order to get that data, it was like a wild goose chase trying to find the correct people that could pull that data, that had permissions for that data, that could like tell you the narrative behind that data, the reason behind it, right? And so just imagine that on a much smaller scale than Amazon, that being able to, hey, I'm putting together a company report on all of our data for the last month, rather than chasing down Henry in finance and Lisa in marketing, just like, hey, our MCPs are built into Claude, and I can go in and ask it all of the questions that I have when I'm putting together this report, and I can actually get the most updated information that's pulled from an MCP.
And, not only in Claude, but we can also do this back in N8N. So one of the things with these workflows is you could actually, right here where we have this MCP client, so we could actually ask the same question and have this then recognize that it needs to go do something on Reddit and actually hit the Reddit API in an automation, right? So the fact that you can kind of use an MCP directly in N8N, that same MCP can be used directly in Claude. And then again, in the same MCP, you can even set it up within Cursor, right? So I can actually have those same MCPs like in I can pull you directly into the Cursor MCP and go ahead and add it just like that. And now back in Cursor, all I have to do is wait for it to load the tools. And now I can actually use this while I'm programming. I can automate things the same I would as in Cursor, the same I would in N8N. And to me, that is the main benefit of what MCP can do. When we talk about discoverable, consumable, like that's what it means to me.
It really is that universal wall plug of the fact that you can build it once of all of that information that you want and plug it into all these different AI tools anywhere that you want, because it'll understand that information. This is awesome.
Yeah, there's one thing that I think is kind of like the next big wave of MCP that is just getting started. And so if we think about the fact that we wanted to talk about like how can we improve our business, so we can talk about internal processes, but just like we go out and sell APIs, we can go out and sell usage to MCPs. So you can see a world where you're building things in N8N or building your own custom MCP servers, and then you can actually charge the usage of what those MCPs are being used in. So whether it's being used in Claude, whether it's being used in N8N, it now has the ability to go ahead and be a profitable piece of software.
Yeah, MCP as a service, essentially, right?
Yeah.
There's plenty of businesses that were built on the back of APIs, and, APIs being a thing. I think you can think about MCPs in the same way.
Definitely.
All right, JD. Well, this was magical. I will leave your socials down in the description. And as always, appreciate everybody watching, and peace.